I'm very pleased to welcome our guest tonight. Kelly Hancock is the Director of Programs at the American Civil War Museum in Richmond, Virginia. She oversees programs and education at the museum for the general public, students, teachers, senior adults, initiating the research, development, and implementation of programs for audiences both on and off site. A museum professional for over 20 years, she has a passion for uncovering history and bringing to light lesser-known stories from the past. And Kelly is a graduate of Eastern New Mexico University. So once again, welcome, Kelly. Let me get you highlighted here for everyone, and
All right. Thank you, Dave.
you can commence the program.
I am going to be talking tonight about Belle Isle and also showcasing some things from our collection and using that also to look at kind of the broader story of prisoners of war. And I want to start with a quote from a journal that was kept by Sergeant J. Osborne Coburn. This is his entry for Christmas Day, 1863. So this is what Coburn had to say on Christmas. Christmas and nothing but the usual rations, and as hungry as a poor dog. Well, it is the poorest and most cheerless Christmas I ever experienced and that I ever expected to. The weather, which has been very cold, has moderated somewhat, and we hope for better times, even on Belle Isle. Now, by the end of 1863, Belle Isle had a population of roughly 6,300 men, only half of whom were in tents. The others were left to endure the elements as best they could. On the night of November 23rd, 5 men were found frozen to death. One prisoner recalled that 30 men died in one day due to the cold. By this point, rations consisted often of nothing more than cornbread. So, in light of these conditions, it's a testament to Coburn's courage and faith that he could remain optimistic after having been imprisoned on Belle Isle for 2 months. Belle Isle first opened in the summer of 1862, in June of 1862, and it was in response to the overcrowding in Richmond's prisons, chief among them Libby Prison. But by the time they got to June of 1862, Libby was overflowing, as were warehouses nearby. So the Confederates decided to continue to operate Libby as a processing center and as a prison for officers, and to send non-commissioned officers and enlisted men to Belle Isle. Belle Isle in the center of the James River. In fact, it's only about a block from where the American Civil War Museum is located, so it's very close. It was and I guess is still, a 54-acre island. And the island was owned by the Old Dominion Iron and Nail Works. They were manufacturing on the island. So the Confederates ended up renting enough land to create a 6-acre prisoner of war camp. And originally, this camp was intended to be a temporary holding place for prisoners. So they would stay there until they were exchanged or sent to points further south. And in looking at this setup, the thought was with the island, with swift rapids in the James, that would deter escape. There was a bridge that went from the south side of the river over to the island, so this was easy, made it easy to bring prisoners from the Richmond Danville Depot. So it seemed to be an ideal place. And as I mentioned, they set up a 6-acre a stockade with a 6-acre perimeter with earthworks that were roughly 3 feet high, and secured 300 Sibley tents for shelter. Now, each of those tents could house 10 men. And often when I talk to students about this, I have them do the math, and rarely they can do the math and come up with 30,000. But that's the capacity for Belle Isle. It was 3,000. Within 2 weeks, the prison had already reached its capacity. And the commandant at the time, Captain Norris Montgomery, he was well liked. He initially allowed the prisoners to go to the river in squads of 5 or 6 so the men could bathe. In fact, in July 15th, one of the newspapers in Richmond, the Inquirer, noted, "Seeing a good time. The prisoners on Belle Isle are encamped on the lower ground of the island, within convenient distance of the water, and at all times in the full face of the breezes that almost continually sweep along the river. They pass away time in exercise, such as wrestling, jumping, and tumbling about generally, apparently caring for nothing and nobody, and quite as contented as they can be under the circumstances. They are supplied with excellent tents, have plenty to eat. Their condition is certainly more enviable than that of several thousands of their comrades not in city prisons." By this point, that the newspaper is putting this very positive spin on this camp, there were 5,000 men imprisoned on Belle Isle. And with overcrowding, the Captain Henry Wirtz, who was in command of all of Richmond's prisons under Brigadier General John Winder, Wirtz ended up revoking all privileges. So the men were no longer allowed to go to the river and bathe. And if that name's sounding a bit familiar to you, it should. Wirtz ends up in charge at Andersonville and, of course, is executed for war crimes. But just about the point that things were kind of reaching a crisis on Belle Isle, there was an exchange cartel that was worked out. And it's known as the Dix Hill Cartel because of the two principal negotiators, D.H. Hill, who's there on the left-hand side, and John A. Dix. Now, there were some reasons why the Union was reluctant to enter into a exchange agreement with the Confederacy. There were those that felt like this would basically be a tacit recognition of the legitimacy of the Confederate government. But there was so much public pressure that the Union ended up doing this. So this cartel agreement was reached July 22nd, 1862, and they agreed on a table of exchanges. Men were to be exchanged man for man, rank for rank. But then there were these equivalents. So a general in chief was worth 60 privates, a major general 40, and so on. So you get the idea of how the exchanges were supposed to work. Now, at the time that this agreement went into place, there were roughly 20,000 Confederates in Union POW camps and between 9 and 12,000 Federals in Confederate prisons. What you see throughout the time that this exchange cartel is in existence is the population of Belle Isle ebbed and flowed depending upon the battles that were being fought. By September, all the prisoners had been exchanged or sent south. Then in January of 1863, following fighting at Fredericksburg, the camp was reactivated. Of course, then in May, following the Battle of Chancellorsville. Now, there were some difficulties to be worked out regarding paperwork, also transportation. These sorts of issues came up. But what proved to be the major sticking point was after Lincoln issued the preliminary Emancipation Proclamation, because the Confederates refused to recognize black men as soldiers. Jefferson Davis declared that white officers leading black troops could legally be put to death. They were guilty of servile insurrection. So on December 28th, 1862, Edwin Stanton, who was the Secretary of War, suspended the exchange of commission officers, but they continued to exchange enlisted men. But then May 1st, 1863, Davis signed into law a joint resolution passed by Congress that stated, quote, all Negroes or mulattoes, slave or free, taken in arms, would be turned over to the authorities in the state in which they were captured, and their officers would be tried by Confederate military tribunals for inciting insurrection and be subject at the discretion of the court and the president to the death penalty. So after this legislation, Henry Halleck on May 25th ordered all exchanges to be halted immediately. So that was the end of this exchange cartel, which existed for a little less than a year. Uh, and in doing this, the Confederate government, in their resisting acknowledging black men as soldiers, they gave the United States an opportunity to pull out of this cartel that officers like Ulysses S. Grant saw was important. It's important. Grant recognized that by exchanging prisoners, they were feeding the Confederate war effort. So later, kind of when there's this push to begin exchanges again, Grant said, every man we hold, when released on parole or otherwise, becomes an active soldier against us. If we commence a system of exchange, we will have to fight on until the whole South is exterminated. If we hold those caught, they amount to no more than dead men. So although this was not a good thing for Union POWs, overall for the war effort, Grant saw this as a necessity. But it did mean this drastic rise in prison populations. Belle Isle was reactivated, and because there was overcrowding, there were stricter security measures put into place. So bathing in the James River was restricted. The use of the latrines at night was prohibited. They instituted bucking and gagging as a punishment for stealing food. And those earthworks that had started out about 3 feet in height were raised to roughly 5 feet. And then they had guards placed at 40-foot intervals on top of those earthworks. The camp itself was laid out with 60 streets radiating from a central avenue. And then there were 50 tents lining those streets. And then outside the camp, which you can kind of see in this Wode sketch here, is where there were officers' tents and also tents for the guards, hospital tents. One thing that they did to try to maintain some order within the camp is to form the men into squads, and a sergeant was given charge of procuring the rations for those men, and the squads of 100 men. The men were not allowed to go to the river to get water, and instead the authorities dug a canal through the camp. Now, the problem with this is it was relatively close to the latrines. So when the latrines overflowed, that human waste polluted the canal. So the men in the summer resorted to sinking barrels into the sand. This island where the camp was set up, it was kind of a sandy, flat plain. By September, the number of prisoners on Belle Isle was reported to be between 4,000 and 5,000. John Hussey, who was a delegate with the U.S. Sanitary Commission, reported in November of '63 that the soldiers on Belle Isle are suffering from beyond endurance. They have not tents into which by crowding more than one half can enter at all. The remainder sleep without on the bare ground, without sufficient clothing, and almost entirely without blankets. They are dying at a rate of 8 and 10 daily now, and the rate must fearfully increase from this point on. And it was in November November 2nd at 8 p.m. that Sergeant J. Osborne Coburn first entered the camp on Belle Isle. And from then until his last entry, just 6 days before his death on March 6th, 1864, Coburn kept a journal in which he vividly described the privations and suffering on Belle Isle. And throughout this journal, he was ever hopeful that he would be exchanged, that those exchanges would be resumed. This is the published version of Coburn's journal, Hell on Belle Isle, which is was edited by Don Allison. And I wanted to just share a few of the accounts that Coburn left. So November 2nd, the day that he entered the camp, he wrote, "We were turned into its dirty streets to get along as best we could till morning, without overcoats, blankets, or shelter of any kind, and only one small stick of wood to 10 men." Then at the end of the month, November 30th, he wrote, "I know the Confederates are hard pressed by our armies on all sides, and their means cut very close, but they might certainly furnish us with wood to warm us and our rations." And then New Year's Eve, 1863, a cold rainstorm lasting all day. During the night, the water ran in so that it was an inch or two deep where I lay. I have wished many times since I have been here that I had quarters as comfortable as my father's hogs, but actually I have not. Then January 8th, 1864, I had to stand with frozen feet from 11 until 2 o'clock. I did not get an overcoat as I expected, but got a new shirt. I put it on and slept between it for a long time, the night being the coldest yet. And then on January 18th, it is 3 months since I was captured. Then I expected that all enlisted men would be paroled and exchanged and returned to our lines. We were full of health, heart, hope, and spirits. We were fleshy, having known but little of hunger. We were confident in our ability to endure almost anything. But now we are down, clear down, starved out. Our flesh, as well as hope and spirits, are all broken or nearly so. We get peevish and irritable, cross, dirty, and careless. Eat like beasts, our faces and hands begrimed with dirt and pine smoke, and but little inclination to wash them, or strength if we had. Overcrowding, filth, exposure, starvation, disease, these were not unique to Belle Isle or even to Southern prisons. Conditions in northern camps could be equally atrocious. At Camp Chase in Ohio, temperatures in December and January dipped to 10 to 20 degrees below zero, causing John King, who was with the Company H of the 40th Georgia Infantry, to recall, "When the chilling winds and the frost and the ice of this bleak region came, with our bodies wasted by starvation, without fires sufficient to warm our emaciated forms, there came a season of real suffering, of real pain, that ended only in the death of many a helpless victim." And on Johnston's Island, which was located a few yards from Lake Erie, Henry Kidd Douglas recalled that it was just the place to convert visitors to the theological belief of the Norwegians that hell has torments of cold instead of heat. And it was here that another prisoner recorded that they burned every available chair that they could find, every box, even parts of their bunks. And he said that the men maintained life by forming a circle and dancing with the energy of despair. After the breakdown of the cartel, conditions worsened, and it soon became obvious that the Confederacy had neither the means nor perhaps the will to care for Union POWs. And then reports of atrocities on Belle Isle and in other southern prisons prompt reprisals in the North. Beginning in 1864, rations to Confederate prisoners were reduced. They weren't allowed access to sutlers. They were prohibited from receiving food sent from home. And Edwin Stanton, the Secretary of War, articulated a policy of doing what was only indispensable. So by the time you move into 1864, there's this hardening of attitudes on both sides. Now, the Confederates, in desperation, did end up releasing prisoners who were ill. They sporadically did this so that they could get medical care, and to just kind of relieve themselves of the burden for caring for these prisoners. This is an engraving that appeared in Harper's Weekly in December 1863, and it was published with an article decrying the treatment of Union prisoners. So each side pointed fingers at the other. Each side claimed to be doing everything that they could for the prisoners. But you see especially this argument being played out in the press. And these are engravings that appeared in Frank Leslie's in early 1864. In all, over the course of the war, there were just over 400, almost 410,000 prisoners of war, just under 200,000 Union prisoners of war, just over 200,000 Confederate prisoners of war, just over 30,000 U.S. deaths, and almost 26,000 Confederate deaths. So simply stated, 1 in 7 men became a prisoner of war, and 1 in 7 POWs died. Regardless of what prison a soldier was in, there were some things that were quite similar about the experience. Usually right away when coming into a prison, the new soldiers were searched. They were stripped of any articles of value. But in spite of this, they managed to smuggle in money, knives, books, jewelry, these little personal possessions. And even if a soldier was able to smuggle things past the guards, there was also the problem of keeping those from the men who were already in the prison camp. New prisoners were regarded as fresh fish, and they were often treated as easy targets because this becomes a very dog-eat-dog environment. With limited resources, competition for space was fierce, and it was not unheard of for new prisoners to have to try to buy space with whatever they had been able to bring in with them, or perhaps trading rations. Sanitation was basically non-existent. In fact, there were prisoners that reported only 1 bath in 6 months. And the floors in these prisons, even though often these are warehouses with wooden floors, the floors became so covered with slime and filth that they looked like they were made out of earth. One prisoner noted, "We can neither sit nor lie down without getting besmeared." These men are dealing with lice, fleas, ticks, bed bugs, flies, gnats, rats, mice, all sorts of common pests. There were some prisoners that were so eaten by lice that it looked like they had so many scabs on them, it looked like they were recovering from smallpox. Yet, in the midst of this, soldiers did try to find the bright side. Here in Richmond, a group of men formed the Richmond Prison Association, and they had as as their official seal, a ring of lice chasing each other, and then in the center were the words bite and be damned. Now, in many prisons, the rations were only given out once a day. They were given at noon. Certainly, if a prisoner was wise and if he was able to maintain self-control, he would try to spread those rations out during that 24-hour period. But often men were so crazed by hunger, they didn't do that. They consumed what little food they got in one sitting. So the men in these camps resort to doing what they can to provide additional nourishment. So there are accounts of prisoners trapping and eating rats. In fact, at Camp Chase in Ohio, one soldier wrote that when properly dressed and fried in pork grease, a rat has the exact flavor of squirrel. Now, I've never had squirrel, so I'm not exactly sure what that flavor is, but you get the idea. And on Belle Isle, there were rumors that the prisoners ate dogs. Same thing with Rock Island in Illinois. Of course, in the midst of these conditions, disease was unavoidable. And you have those standard Civil War diseases that I'm sure everybody's familiar with: typhoid fever, pneumonia, diarrhea, and dysentery. Scurvy was also quite common. And a major part of prison life is monotony, standing in line for rations, for roll call, for the latrines, for water. Remember Osborne Coburn, who stood in line just to get that shirt, stood in line for 3 hours. But in the midst of all of this death, disease, squalor, filth, soldiers, in an effort to overcome the monotony or to supplement their meager rations, put their creative talents to work. So men formed debating clubs and theatrical societies. They published newspapers. They held louse races and gambled. They drew. These are some drawings in our collection that were done by Z.T. Ross, who was imprisoned at Fort Delaware. There's another one there that was by Ross. We also have here, these are trinkets made out of bone and shell, earrings carved from nuts. They used whatever they could find, whatever ever natural substance, gutta percha, and they're very intricate. A lot of these pieces, these are all in the museum's collection. Some a little bit more utilitarian. This is a chess set that Maurice Evans of Company A, 4th Virginia Cavalry, carved while he was at Point Lookout, Maryland. And in his the letter that he wrote when he donated this to the museum, he said, "Time passed away slowly. Hence, to drive dull care away, we had to contrive some mode to keep insanity from taking hold. And your humble servant, with the aid of a jackknife, made from the slats in the bottom of a bunk a set of chessmen and board, with which many hours passed quite pleasantly." Now, some soldiers also made things to give to guards, either for gratitude or perhaps extra privileges. These were made by an officer imprisoned at Libby. These are probably my absolute favorite things in our POW collection, made from beef bone. They also made articles for loved ones, created items for trade and to secure additional rations. So you have men who sew clothes. They cut hair as barbers. They made soap, anything that they could make to sell or to trade. George C. Richwood, who was with the 1st Florida Infantry, plied his trade as an artist. This is his advertisement for painting names in Bibles. And Ridgewood was imprisoned at Fort Delaware. We know a little bit about what J. Osborne Coburn did. Uh, he was very enterprising. He got some beef bones that he boiled, made into broth. He ate a little of the broth, then he sold the rest. He also had managed to secret in a Masonic pin that he sold for $10 in Confederate money. And with that money, he bought rice and molasses. Once again, after eating a little bit of it, sold that to make even more. But the most enterprising thing that Osborne did, and I wonder how he was able to do this, he made Confederate dollar bills. On February 10th, 1864, he recorded, finished another Confederate counterfeit bill. For a week past, this is the way I keep up extra rations. Pretty business for me making counterfeit money. Men also spent a great deal of time thinking about escape, planning escape, and attempting to implement those plans. Initially, the prison officials were caught off guard. They weren't able to stop escapees. On September 14th, 1862, a Richmond newspaper reported that at least 20 Yankees have taken leave since the Manassas battle. At Alton Prison in Illinois on November 16th, there were 4 Confederates who escaped by climbing over the prison walls, prompting a local newspaper to say, there is gross negligence somewhere for prisoners to have to get ladders and climb over prison walls within 10 steps of a sentinel. Now, as officials began to improve the security in prisons, it became a little bit more difficult to escape. But tunneling was still something that could be quite successful. And I bet you all may be familiar with the escape from Libby Prison, where officers were able to gain access to the cellar. Were able to get to the from the kitchen to the cellar, and spent months digging this tunnel that ran under 20th Street, and were able to come up into a yard of another warehouse that had a fence surrounding it. And on the night of February 9th, morning of the 10th, there were 109 men who escaped from Libby. Now, about half of those ended up being recaptured. But this was not the first nor the last attempt at escape. In November of 63, there were Confederate prisoners who tunneled out of the Ohio State Penitentiary. They were able to take knives from the dining hall, chip away at the stone, get into an air vent, and then use that to tunnel out. And going back to Richmond at Castle Thunder, there were 15 men who smeared themselves with croton oil to give their skin this yellowy look to convince prison officials that they had smallpox. So then the men were sent to one of the hospitals. They attempted to tunnel out from the hospital, but Captain Alexander was waiting at the other end of the tunnel because there were some prisoners that informed on them. There were other escapes. There were some escapes from Belle Isle. This from the Richmond Sentinel in 1864 records 2 separate incidents on the same night where there were 2 men who try to swim to shore. They end up being shot, 1 killed, 1 wounded. And then later that same night, there's a second attempt. And we do have a couple of artifacts dealing with escape in our collection. This is a beautiful cane. And according to the donor, he said, a man by the name of Mackenzie, and this part of the cane actually has Mackenzie's name carved into it. A man by the name of Mackenzie, a prisoner on the island, and he's referring to Johnson's Island, with 5 others had tunneled under the stockade. They were escaping on the ice when my father, at this time a guard, a boy of only 16, discovered them. He shot 1 and the rest surrendered, including Mackenzie. Later on, my father was very kind to him And in consideration of his courtesy, and this is the guy's father's name, Sherman, he carved this cane and made a present of it. And the donor went on to say that I regret that owing to an accident while absent from the office, this cane was broken, but it can be repaired very easily. And then much more utilitarian, not nearly as pretty, this just very basic knife that Samuel Venable used to cut his way out of a boxcar outside of Atlanta. For many, the only escape from the suffering was death, and death rates hovered at or above 10% in many of the prisons in both the North and the South, especially during the winter of 1863, 1864. According to a volunteer surgeon, Daniel Meeker, the mortality rate averaged 50 per day or 1,500 a month in Richmond's prisons. And over the winter of 1863, 1864, there were anywhere between 6 and 10,000 men imprisoned on Belle Isle. Surgeon G.W. Semple, in his report to the medical director, William Carrington, stressed the urgency of the situation. By this point, rations are extremely meager. If they did get a sort of cornbread, it was made from grinding not just the corn, but the corn cob, unsifted cornmeal, which led to diarrhea. Men, because of the overcrowding on Belle Isle, weren't allowed to go to the latrines at night. So if you think about soldiers with diarrhea and dysentery, they can't go to the latrines. They're certainly going to relieve themselves right outside their tents. Also, because of the exceedingly cold temperatures during this winter, a lot of the men, they're outside walking around at night, doing their best to keep warm. They're walking around in the day. So there was really no way to clean the streets and remove the filth that was building up in them. As Semple put it, the whole surface of the camp has thus been saturated with putrid animal matter. So it was obvious to Confederate authorities that something had to be done. The Richmond Sentinel on December 30th reported change of base, that they were going to start shipping these prisoners. In February, Josiah Gorgas, the Confederate chief of ordnance, recorded in his journal that 400 prisoners a day were being sent to Georgia. And these men are being sent to Camp Sumter, which we know as Andersonville now. That's the popular name for it. And in their rush to alleviate the overcrowding that was on Belle Isle and in Richmond's prisons, they're shipping these men by the boxcar load even before this new camp at Andersonville was built. They didn't have a stockade that was complete. There weren't hospitals. There weren't barracks. The bakery hadn't been built yet. And these men are just being shipped out of Richmond, going from one disastrous place to an even worse disaster. And according to one historian, 90% of the men from Belle Isle weighed less than 100 pounds. So I'm sure you're familiar with these horrific images of prisoners from Belle Isle. So this is the way these men look as they're leaving Belle Isle. Now, these are some of the soldiers, I should say, that were released for medical care. And there's this rush to get prisoners out of Richmond because by this point in Richmond, women are having trouble putting food on the table for their families. Back in spring of 1863, there had been bread riots. People in the city feel like, why are these resources going to Union POWs? Why are resources going to the enemy that could be feeding our children. And there's also that worry in Richmond about a prison break and about Union cavalry raids, which is borne out in March of 64 with the Kilpatrick-Dahlgren raid. Richmond authorities recognize the need to get prisoners out of Belle Isle. So this, coupled with a slight resumption of exchanges, kind of leaves Belle Isle by the end of June, well, by the end of March, without pretty much any prisoners. Of course, then again, it's cyclical as the Overland Campaign begins to add more prisoners. So by the end of June, Belle Isle was back in business, but it never really reached those same heights of population that it had during that winter of 63, 64. In Belle Isle's 18 months of sporadic operation, it's estimated that anywhere from 20,000 to 30,000 prisoners of war passed through the camp. No one knows for certain how many men died. There were only 210 graves that were moved from Belle Isle to the Richmond National Cemetery, but that number is far, far too low. So the estimate is somewhere between 1 and 3,000. And if it's up to 3,000, you're looking at about 10 to 15% of the prison population dying, which then seems to be about average for Southern prisons, well below what occurs at Andersonville with about 25% of the inmates dying. But the men who were imprisoned under these terrible circumstances, they formed very strong bonds. And in the years after the war, you see them having reunions, kind of celebrating the fact that they're survivors of this experience, and even trying to find each other, trying to reach out to each other. In 1906, Thomas Sharp of Company F, 2nd Division from West Virginia, published in the National Tribune a little announcement. He was a survivor of Belle Isle, Andersonville. He asked some questions. He said, 1, who of the 500 sent from Pemberton Prison to Belle Isle on New Year's Eve, 1863, are living today? 2, who can give all or any of the 9 men who froze to death that night? 3, who killed Lieutenant Boisseau's dog? 4, who remembers the market on Belle Isle and the cry, 1 quart corn stew, smoking hot, right off the fire, 5 cents white money, $5 Confederate? 6, who was it that cut the car loose from the trainload of ex-prisoners on their way to Andersonville from Richmond on the night of March 9th, 1864? And what became of the party? Comrade Sharp would like to hear from any of the survivors of those days of torture. So with that, I will draw this presentation to a close, and I'm happy to take some questions.